And I wanted to start today with a quote from Carl Jung from his text Alchemical Studies, which is volume 13 of his collected works, in case you'd like to consult with the original. I wore out my original copy, but have a nice fresh one here. And so in the section where he's discussing the symbolism of the tree, he makes a rather provocative comment that maybe some of you have heard. He says, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And so what did he mean by this? And how is this idea relevant to our theme of alchemical transformation and healing? And this guiding statement, or this invitation to make the darkness conscious, is really at the heart of the depth psychological traditions, which are concerned with not only our conscious experience, what we already know, what I'm aware of in this moment, but with the unconscious, which is really that which we don't know. And so making the darkness conscious is a summary, we might say, of what's often referred to as illuminating or integrating the shadow, which in my experience is really an essential aspect of any path of depth, of wholeness, of creativity, of aliveness. I mean, I might even go so far as to say it's a requirement. It's not really an option. And I hope to speak about, maybe why I've come to see it that way. And so while this idea of shadow work is talked about in some circles, in my experience, it's often an area of inquiry that's often misunderstood or left out altogether. And so the basic idea is that if we avoid or sidestep or bypass this dimension of our experience, or if we pretend it's not there, or that we've risen above it, or that it doesn't apply to us. And we do see this, actually, these ideas in some forms of contemporary spirituality. But if we do this shadowy, unconscious material will leak out, usually in less than ideal ways, and can generate a lot of unnecessary suffering for ourselves and others, and also for our world, our culture, our society, and for our earth. I mean, we can just look around the planet right now and see the devastating effects of disowning or disavowing the shadow, and how that which remains unilluminated and unintegrated within us, personally, culturally, and collectively, can and will find its way into the world. I mean, to name just one manifestation of this, we can look to the systemic racism, which has been brought to light in a really devastating yet critical and heartbreaking way over the last few years. An emanation of a powerful and unconscious cultural and collective shadow that is presenting itself to us now for attention, for integration, for healing, for consciousness, for awareness. And while we don't have the time to go too deeply into it in this particular course, the shadow isn't only personal. There's a cultural shadow, material that an entire culture has pushed out of awareness, as well as the collective shadow of our human species, which we may see linked to climate and to the earth herself. Just as there are personal, cultural, and collective manifestations of trauma, we see this with shadow as well. There are also intergenerational dimensions to trauma and to shadow. And while sometimes we speak about these layers of the shadow as separate, which can be helpful theoretically in certain ways, the line between them is not so bright. And the truth is that they're interweaving and interpenetrating all the time. So why don't we start with a basic working definition of the shadow, which we'll unpack, I hope, as we move forward. And to say it simply, the shadow refers to any part of ourselves or our experience that has been deemed unacceptable. Any aspect of our personality that runs counter to the idea that we have of ourselves, or threatens to rupture one of our core attachment bonds, or otherwise bring us face to face with shame, with anxiety, with fear. And so to avoid this rejection, this anxiety, this shame, that particular experience or that aspect of our personality is pushed outside of our conscious awareness. And it's located or sent into what we call the shadow. So what's in the shadow then has a sense of otherness to it. It's other to who or what we think of as ourselves. And we say, that's not me, that's someone else, that's something else. And so I think it's important to say that the shadow isn't a place and it's not a thing. It's not something that we're going to find in our immediate embodied experience. In that sense, it's not a literal thing. The shadow is an image, it's a metaphor, it's an imaginal atmosphere in the psyche or in the soul, which receives and holds the unwanted, the marginalized, the unbearable, the unendurable. And it's a container, really, for the darker aspects of the personality. It's the psychic landscape, we might say, where the lost orphans of psyche and soma end up. And they live and move and breathe from within that space, erupting out of the underworld from time to time in what we might call a trigger or some sort of emotional activation where we become hooked or inflamed, or shadow material can even show up as unexplainable symptoms in the body, as a strange mood, as rage or depression or restlessness or shame. Unintegrated shadow material has a way of coming into our experience as neurotic symptoms. I mean, you might think of it as an invisible interior landscape of feeling and experience that we can become aware of, but not directly. And this is important. We can't look directly at our own shadow, as by definition, the shadow is unconscious, meaning it's not readily available for reflection. We can't just sit down on our meditation cushion and look at the shadow. I mean, that's really what we mean when we say that something is unconscious, is that it's not available for immediate, ordinary reflection. It's hidden. We can't just close our eyes in prayer or meditation or inquiry and say, okay, I'm going to look at the shadow now. And the unconscious doesn't work like that. If it did, then it wouldn't be the unconscious. But despite this, we can come to see and know and experience the manifestations or the expressions of the shadow as it makes itself known to us through dreams and fantasies and unexpected moods and symptoms, and also through a process called projection, which is an alchemical process, actually, and an incredibly important process on the path. And in my experience, one that's really quite misunderstood. Projection is a natural, organic activity of the psyche that we're engaged in all the time, actually, which allows us the opportunity to be in touch with parts of ourselves that have fallen out of awareness. I might even say, that the process of projection is the primary way that we have to meet the shadow and to be able to integrate it, to allow it to come back into conscious embodied awareness, where it can resume its rightful place in that overall ecology of the soul. And then we don't have to act it out in our relationships with others and with the world. This withdrawal of projection is actually the activity of love. I mean, just how about an example? Let's say I see myself as a kind, selfless, compassionate, spiritual person. And these particular qualities, let's say, are vital aspects of my identity and my sense of self. And perhaps I was rewarded for these qualities as a young child, and then also learned that these were ideal qualities to cultivate on the spiritual path, and that their presence was a sign of my own enlightenment or self-realization. I'm simplifying a bit here, but just for the sake of an example, what can happen in this vignette is that in order to hold all of this together, we have to sequester any experience that runs counter to that. For example, the experience of anger or the capacity to engage in healthy conflict. And all of those perceptions, feelings, emotions, and behaviors associated with that are sent into the shadow. And as a result, we develop a very phobic or avoidant relationship with anger and boundary and any ideas, feelings, and behaviors which contradict the image I have of myself as selfless and kind and spiritual and open and compassionate. But of course, the capacity to make skillful use of anger and aggressive energy are incredibly important, natural and essential human capacities. We need to be able to be in a conscious and embodied relationship with these emotions and these energies. And if we're not, that's going to deeply affect our ability to take care of ourselves, to assert our needs, to enact healthy boundaries, and at times to privilege our own interiority, to protect ourselves and to protect those around us. It takes a tremendous amount of energy, and I think this point is really important. Mentally, emotionally, somatically, and also at a deep spiritual level, to keep this contradictory material outside of awareness. And in my observation, actually, much of the soul level sort of exhaustion that so many of us feel is a result, at least in part, of years, of decades, of even generations of splitting off parts of ourselves and relegating them into the shadow. And this is passed down intergenerationally. And so this capacity to deny, to disavow, or dissociate from contradictory, anxiety-provoking emotion, perception, and ways of being, to be able to push this material out of awareness and into the shadow, this was adaptive. It was creative, and it was even life-saving for many of us as young children in our families of origin. But at some point, and I think for many of us that some point, maybe right now, we might start to realize that these young protective strategies, as essential as they were as early attempts at self-care, may no longer be necessary, nor serving our deepest yearnings, right, for a life of meaning, connection, creativity, spontaneity, freedom. And so in the previous example where I was rewarded for being a kind, selfless person who privileges others without having any needs of my own, never becoming angry or assertive. This becomes part of my ego structure as well as my persona, that mask that I show the world, my outward facing personality. And of course, these are very noble qualities, kindness and consideration of others. And the point here isn't to dispute that in any way, of course not. But what's fallen into the shadow in this example is the very genuine and human need to respect my autonomy and my personal integrity, to honor my own interiority, and to be able at times to privilege and assert my own needs and to enact clear boundaries. All of these things are essential aspects of self-realization and of healing in my experience, which require a healthy and embodied and mature relationship with the natural energies of aggression. And so in my relationships with lovers and friends and coworkers and family and with the culture and with society and with the world, even with God or with the divine or with the beloved, whenever a situation arises which calls for a healthy expression of anger, or to have and to assert a need, or to enact a boundary, or express my disappointment, my annoyance, my irritation, there's going to be a lot of anxiety that goes along with that. A sense of panic or claustrophobia, or a deep feeling that this isn't safe. It's not safe to express anger, or to disappoint someone, or to challenge someone, or to privilege my own needs and my own interiority and my own view. That's just not okay. And many of us, of course, learned this the hard way. And so what happens is that all of this unfelt material finds its way into the shadow as a way of protecting us against that shakiness, that anxiety, and that unsafety that these thoughts, feelings, and behaviors have come to be associated with. But of course, pushing this material outside of our awareness and locating it in the shadow, in the underworld, in Hades, it's not the same thing as this material being integrated and healed. So from deep down in the underworld of the psyche, and we can see images of this, of course, in mythology and fairy tales and in religious and alchemical symbolism, this material is still alive and well. The lost orphan is there, pleading, calling out for you, affecting our perception, our well-being, our relationships, and our sense of self, and affecting our life energy more generally, as it takes so much energy to continue to keep this material out of conscious awareness. That has to be maintained. We maintain that moment by moment, day by day, year by year, decade by decade, generation by generation. And so this idea of shadow work, what Jung was pointing to in that statement, involves a process of making the darkness conscious, shining the light of a curious, embodied, discerning awareness into the dark places, and going into those places and finding the persons and the figures that are waiting there. Maybe they're frozen there, or trapped, or lost, or afraid. The lost orphans of Psyche and Soma, who have been carrying the shadow pieces of us for so long, for years and decades, and in many cases, through the generations. the shadow of the ancestors. I mean, there are lost orphans who derive from our personal, biographical, familial history, as well as those who are emanations of the culture, of society, of the ancestors themselves. And when we do this work with the shadow, which is again oriented in relationship, like all alchemical practice, it's entering into a relationship with the shadow, getting close to it in a tactile way, but not so close that we fuse. By way of this relationship, we can start to release that pent up psychic energy that I mentioned that may be contributing to the experience of exhaustion, tiredness, flatness, numbness, and our inability to step fully into life, to no longer hold back or postpone our participation here.